when you're required to do the work of another type at the expense of the type that you are more in alignment with, that misalignment really creates a friction. And I think that friction over time is what wears people down, because you're still putting in the same amount of time, still putting in all the work into what you're doing. But all that time and energy and attention is to going to stuff that doesn't fully feel meaningful for you and is actually holding you back from contributing in the way that you want to. And it's certainly not the only cause of burnout, but I would say a misalignment between a teacher and the center of gravity of their school definitely creates the conditions for burnout.
Welcome to Innovating Education, the podcast where we explore solutions that are shaping the future of learning. I'm your host, Dr. Riley Williams, and in each episode we sit down with educators, policymakers, and change makers who are reimagining education through fresh ideas and innovative practices. Our goal is to spark meaningful change by sharing strategies that create better outcomes for students, teachers, and communities. Whether you're a teacher looking for new approaches, an administrator seeking impactful programs, or simply passionate about education, this podcast is your go-to source for insights that matter. Today, we're joined by Rob McLeod, an experienced educator with 16 years of international teaching and leadership across Canada, Germany, and Belgium. Rob has worked in public, private, and international schools, serving as a teacher, curriculum coordinator, and principal. His diverse experience gives him deep understanding of how education systems shape both students and educators. Beyond his work in schools, Rob co-hosts the Reinventing Education podcast, where he explores innovative frameworks that help schools evolve with changing needs of students, teachers, and communities. In this episode, we'll dive into his 3 types of schools model. Let's get started. Welcome to the show, Rob.
Thank you so much, Riley. Happy to be here.
Before we dive into your 3 types of school model, I'd love for our listeners to get to know you a bit better. Can you share about your journey into education? What inspired you to become an educator, and how have your experiences across different countries and school systems shaped your perspective on learning and teaching?
Yeah, I was one of those people who had both a positive and negative experience of school growing up. I was really lucky to have just a series of fantastic teachers throughout my primary school years. And then I had a hit or miss collection of teachers in my high school years, where some subjects I did quite well, others I did not. And I wasn't a straight A student in my high school time. I was in this weird double cohort year where there were like twice as many people applying to get into university due to some changes in the Ontario system. I wasn't able to actually go to university the first time around when I wanted to, and ended up starting at 21 as a mature student, having done a year of horticulture and landscape design experience. Fast forward a few years later, a few adventures along the way, like being a radio DJ and doing a few other interesting jobs, I managed to finish up my teaching qualifications. I started teaching in Ontario, Canada. And again, due to that double cohort year and some of the echo effects and several other things, it was a really difficult time to be a new teacher in Ontario. I was really lucky to have work, but every year it was like my contract was getting more complicated and less exciting. And by my third year, I was split between 3 different schools, multiple classrooms, and it just wasn't allowing me to be the kind of teacher I wanted to be. So I thought, I've had lots of people who've encouraged me to go teach abroad. I'll go do that for 2 years, and then I will come back and see if things have become a little bit more friendly for new teachers. Those 2 years have turned in now almost to 12 years. I met my wife along the way when I was in Germany, worked in Germany for 5 years, and I'm now just coming in on 7 years in Belgium.
Wow, that's impressive. So, one of the core frameworks that you've developed in this time is the 3 types of school model, which categorizes schools as expert, coach, or counselor types. This model has really resonated with educators looking to better understand how different school structures shape learning environments. Could you start by giving us an overview of the model? What are the key characteristics of each type, and what inspired you to create this framework?
Yeah, so the inspiration came through both the work that myself and Brendan O'Leary, he's my podcast co-host, We had worked together in Germany, and we were two people who just really reflected a lot on our practice. We're both very passionate educators, and I guess we just kept bumping into this inquiry of like, how do we make schools better? And what became apparent to us, like applying a few different sociological models and looking at a few different organizational models to school, was that school is not one thing. When we talk about schools and improving schools and developing schools, we talk about them as though they are a single thing, that if we just add these new practices and this little tweak, like it's constantly getting better. But what we really started to see is school is actually three things. And there are three types of schools. And we are saying that these three types are three different and somewhat even contradictory answers to the idea of what is a good education, or what should a school do, or what is a good school. And we gave them these three names: expert, coach, and counselor, to represent the three roles that these schools have. And they're very different roles. And the way you do one well is not the way you do another one well. In fact, doing one well actually hinders or goes against the ways of doing other things, because there are so many good ideas for what we can be doing in schools, good ideas on their own. But as soon as you bring those ideas to communities of people or organizations, some of them align, some of them don't. Some of them start messing with the ecosystem that's already there. Some get absorbed by the ecosystem and foster and flourish. And especially for someone who's moved between a few different countries, you start to see that things that we just take for granted as, oh, this is the way schools are. Once you move to another country, it is really like entering another planet. Some of the things that used to just be normal, or the way gravity worked in your home country, isn't the way it works in this other place. And it really opened my eyes to see that, it's interesting that we can do the same initiative in one school, whether it's the same country or a different country, but we can do the same initiative in one school and it can totally click. And then you do that exact same initiative with another school and it maybe has a mediocre response, and you do the exact same initiative with another school and it's outright rejected and rebelled against and pushed back. So this idea of the three types of inquiring into like, why is this the case? And Brendan and I, we've both had our successes and definite failures in terms of initiatives or things we've tried to do in schools. And once we saw this idea of the three types, it's almost like we couldn't unsee it. And it was like the thing that's just that one layer down below the surface that was influencing this idea of, what's good for one type and will be taken on by one type won't necessarily be taken on by the others. And it's three very distinct ways. These are three very distinct ways to organize a school, three distinct types of cultures in school, and just three different practices or ways to approach practices and beliefs and values in schools.
So the first one being the expert model. And I love the visual that you give, which is pyramid, because this is a hierarchical model. What are the core beliefs about learning that underpin the expert model, and why might a school choose this approach?
Yeah, and just as I get into discussing this idea of expert, what I'd encourage someone listening to this to do is to listen to the description of these three. And the power of this model isn't just some kind of academic thing or like a personality test. What Simpsons character are you? What type of school are you? Whatever. This, to me, the first step of actually applying this is knowing which of these three you are, and then being able to see, am I a match for my school? Does my school lean towards this type and foster it? So as we're going through the description of each, the expert, coach, and counselor, as you're listening to this, I just encourage people to notice which one they resonate with, but also very importantly, which one they might have kind of an allergy or a resistance to as they're hearing these descriptions. So yeah, the shapes for the three, I give a shape to each. So for the expert, we say the pyramid. And that's really to represent where authority and decision-making comes from. And that pyramid's reflected both at the school level and in the classroom. So at a whole school level, there's very clear hierarchy. There's leadership, and then there's teaching staff. And it's very clear who's in charge of what. It's not like one group accidentally starts doing the work of the other. Very clear hierarchy, you know your role. In the classroom, we're basically saying that a teacher is the top of that pyramid in their classroom. And the implication this has for teaching is that teachers in an expert school really rely on autonomy. Because we're saying once that door is closed or open to your classroom, you are in charge of deciding about the teaching and learning that's happening in there. Now, of course, there are guidelines, curriculums you need to follow, ministry policies, all those things, of course. But the actual teaching and learning decisions in your classroom fall on your shoulders yourself.
And how does this affect the learning process?
Yeah, so it's difficult to nail this down to just one thing, because I would say the learning process is dependent on that expert teacher's professional discernment and their autonomy. This could look like an incredibly wide variety of approaches depending on who those teachers are. One common thread, though, that I do tie between the three is this idea of after a student leaves their time in your classroom, I boil these three types, the expert, coach, and counselor, down to three main priorities. And I talk about responsibility for the expert, achievement for coaches, and meaning for counselors. And of course, all three types value all three. Whether you're expert, coach, or counselor, of course, on your radar is valuing responsibility, achievement, and meaning. But when times get hard or there's not much time for something, or you have to prioritize one, either in your classroom or at a school decision level, each type will hold on to its priority first and is willing to some degree to sacrifice the other two to ensure that theirs continues on and thrives, and is not interested in sacrificing theirs in pursuit of the other two. So for the expert, their priority being responsibility, everything that they're doing with their autonomy, in the background, there's this idea of that responsibility is what they're really instilling. No matter what the content, no matter what the skills, no matter what approach or resources they're using, in the background, there's this sense of if the student left today and they got nothing else from my classroom, I at least want to ensure they're leaving here more responsible than when they came in. And that's for the expert. Same for the coach. They would say, I want people to have achieved more than when they came in. And for the counselor, they'd say, I want someone leaving with a greater sense of meaning when they came in. So it's a bit difficult to answer exactly what that looks like for the expert, other than to say, through their work, they're prioritizing responsibility, and it's up to their professional discernment about what the teaching and learning looks like in their classroom.
So critics sometimes associate hierarchy models with rigidity. How can schools following this model still nurture students' passion and curiosity?
Yeah, so there's two really important things here. And one is this idea of a tug of war in education. And then the second is the idea that each of these types can be done well, poorly, or somewhere in between. So just before I answer that specifically from an expert perspective, to me, the largest unspoken problem in education today is this invisible tug of war between these three types. At a nation level, at a state or province level, at a board level, even at a school level, and you can even boil it down to a team level of teachers. You will find experts, coaches, and counselors in every school, and definitely at a more national or provincial state level, we see this kind of tug of war, this swaying back and forth between these approaches. I think if you've been in education more than 5 years, you've probably seen your district or your board or your school go in one direction, and then a few years later say, oh no, we've got new data, we're going the opposite direction. Didn't we 5 years ago say that there was data saying that's not the way we should go? But to me, I see that through this lens of this tug of war. No, there's good things about the expert, there's good things about the coach approach, there's good things about the counselor, and we're doing this move, which has the benefit of we're touching into the good parts of all of them, but The negative side of that is people don't get as invested in things, knowing that we're going to get tugged in some other direction later on. The other piece to that is the idea that each of these three can be done well, okay, or poorly. And it's definitely true that a expert approach done poorly represents some of those negative things that the coach approach is trying to pull us away from. So the positive coach approach says, look, there's kind of these problems with this really rigid expert approach. Here's the really good version of the coach approach, which solves a lot of those problems. What I would say is that rigidity, sometimes when people hear the expert, they get like a stereotype in their mind of just that really like rigid, no nonsense, no sense of humor, strict teacher. Sure, you will find experts like that, but the more you dig into this idea of these three roles, personality isn't the defining feature here. The defining feature is how teaching and learning decisions are made. And yes, you'll find some experts who are that very rigid kind of stereotype that can come to mind, but get talking and you realize that super lovely, warm, soft, 25-year-old kindergarten teacher is also an expert. But the reason that they are is because they're being given autonomy to run their class as they see best fit and make decisions autonomously with their professional discernment. So any personality, any disposition can do any of these types. So when we think of that idea of a rigid hierarchy, yeah, of course, there are drawbacks to all three of these. But what I would say is one benefit of that really clear hierarchy of the pyramid in schools is decisions can just be made faster and there are less bureaucratic steps in the way of a teacher or a leader being able to pursue really important or good work that they want to be doing in their school or classroom.
So we just touched on the coach model, which again, the visual for this is the star, and it really focuses on collaboration as well as being data-driven. How does this influence relationships between teachers, students, and administrators?
Yeah, great question. First of all, just to talk about that shape a little bit and how that connects to the way that people relate. If you imagine the experts pyramid, and I'm talking with my hands for those who might be able to see my video now. But if you imagine that pyramid, it's like the expert pyramid shrinks a bit and then fans out to make the points of a star. And we've shifted from that idea of a really clear hierarchy at the expert to a layered hierarchy in the coach star approach to school. Now, there's still very much a hierarchy. There's still a top of the hierarchy, but its realm of influence has gotten smaller and it's distributed more of that decision-making power and process across the school. And now you're getting a wider variety and diversity of roles that they have 1 foot in the classroom and 1 foot in an administrative role. So you're going to see more instructional coaches, curriculum coordinators, heads of departments, these sorts of things, heads of certain initiatives within the school that are invested with a certain amount of decision-making power themselves. However, they're not completely autonomous because going alongside the coach's star is what's new here in the coach is that the school has a shared school-wide approach to teaching. So we've lost that autonomy of the expert where, a head of school in an expert school hires good people and then gets out of their way. In the coach school with the star, we're saying, no, we're bringing you into a team. And yes, you're going to have to give up some autonomy at our coach school. But in return, you are able to be a part of a team that's larger than any one of its parts. And we can collaborate. And you can now offer teaching and learning experiences that you probably couldn't do on your own just because of the sheer amount of time or management of resources this takes. And now you are part of a team that is working together to offer this shared school-wide approach to learning. So that's the collaborative piece for staff. And then the way that I would say that this works in the classroom is just you or I walk into our classrooms, and what we are doing is horizontally and vertically aligned with the other classrooms in the school. So horizontally, like across our grade level, pretending we're both grade 3 teachers, for example, what's happening in Riley's classroom, what's happening in Rob's classroom mirrors each other. And maybe we can even offer greater differentiation. We could split groups sometimes. We're sharing resources between the two of us, or we're making assessments together, maybe peer moderated marking, something along those lines. But then we're also connecting vertically through the school to, as much as possible, find coherent through lines from our youngest grade to our oldest grades to offer a coherent school-wide approach to things. One possible advantage to the expert is just you have more diversity of approaches, and maybe some of those more diverse approaches work for students. But the same can be said for the coach. Maybe this more uniform, more predictable, more consistent approach to teaching and learning also works for some students better.
Now, data is a key component here. How can schools use data to drive growth without turning learning into a purely performance-based exercise?
Yeah, so there are so many good resources out there to talk about proper ways to use data. The two things I can offer from this model is to give you two red flags just to serve as warnings in practice. One of the downsides of the coach approach, and when it becomes an unhealthy data-driven thing, is when it either becomes reductionist or starts gamifying, as you were alluding to. So when people, or results, or initiatives just get reduced down to numbers, and we lose that human side of what those numbers represent, that's a warning. And then as soon as we're getting into conversations about how can we gamify this data, and there was a great line I heard early in my career where someone just said, you squeeze data hard enough and it can say anything that you want. I guess to steer you away from doing that, my suggestion is, yes, use data. It's an incredible resource. And data is the thing that, for a coach, replaces that expert professional discernment. The coach says, no, I'm less concerned about your gut feeling, intuition, or what your conviction says about what should be happening. I am going, as a coach, I'm going to rely on what the data says, and that's going to inform my practice. And I think the healthy part of coach data usage is when it's informing what we do, and we're focused less, not entirely, but we're just focused less on the outcome and the results and the potential attempts to gamify that.
So offering students more choice in their learning sounds very empowering, but this can also present challenges. How can teachers effectively support student-driven learning with this model?
Yeah, so we'll get into like self-directed learning when we get into the counselor, which is next. The way that I talk about the idea of the coach's approach to offering choice is they are offering choice, but it's closed choice, and it's choices predominantly made by the teacher at the coach stage. If we back up to the expert, just to compare it, it's like the expert, they're choosing what to learn. Now, of course, like coming from a curriculum, but they've selected specifically what will be learned. What's different for the coach is still choosing what is to be learned, again, with reference to a curriculum. But a coach is offering choice or various possibilities for how to engage with that. And that's where we get into everything from differentiation, of differentiating product, process, and content. But the idea of the coach, the underlying philosophy, just like an Olympic coach, is they're saying, we're more interested in you performing a personal best. Now, the personal best being academic achievement here. And they're saying, I'm more interested in finding out the way to get you to perform a personal best than I am in you needing to follow certain approaches to this. There's almost a bit more of an almost kind of like entrepreneurial scientific method approach here of how can we use data to guide our experiments here, but let's find the ways that we can optimize student learning. So I'd say that's what's behind this kind of like coach approach to things.
So in this model, there is a focus on achievement and growth. How do successful schools maintain a balance between fostering intrinsic passion and encouraging performance?
Yeah, so I would say that is like $1 million question. I think you could find a few really good coach teachers to give you like some really specific strategies. What I would say though, just building off my last point of coaches are in search of the strategies that optimize your performance. I think coaches want to offer choice to the degree that is possible. And I think that's where you can encourage performance and still foster some of that intrinsic passion. And the best coach teachers and the best expert and counselor teachers are seeking to help you find connections in what you're learning. And again, with the coach, what you are learning is still coming from a curriculum. That is dictated. That's not going to change. But how a coach chooses to engage with it can be tailored to students. I would just simply say this is just coaches' skills coming in terms of how can we differentiate this to find that intrinsic motivation.
In your experience, what strategies do help teachers embrace a more collaborative coach-based style?
Yeah, so this is one of those like kind of cheat codes once you know this 3 types, because we've talked about the autonomy of an expert. We're now talking about the collaboration of the coach, and we'll get to the idea of what negotiation means for the counselor. What I would say I'm bringing that's new to the table to consider is once you know which of these 3 types you are, expert, coach, or counselor, you know which of these 3 ways of working that person's going to default to as soon as they're left alone. You might have a school that is more leaning towards, let's say, the coach approach, where collaboration and this whole school shared approach to teaching and learning is happening. If you're an expert or a counselor in that environment, as soon as you are able to, if you're an expert, you're going to default to your autonomy. And you're going to take that collaborative whole school approach and put your own twist on it every chance you get. And same with the counselor, they're going to take that whole school approach and they're going to filter it through their coach or their counselor lens. And they're going to be negotiating with students and doing self-directed learning every opportunity that they can. So in terms of strengthening that collaboration, I think it's really important to know which of these 3 types you are. And I talk about this in my book, just saying, if you want an oak tree, plant an acorn. Because you can plant a grapevine and you can try and make it grow up straight, but it's not going to be an oak. Just the same way you can plant an acorn and try and put it on a trellis and train it to grow more horizontally like a grapevine, but it's not going to happen. I think as soon as we can articulate what our type is, what our values are, and our preferred way of working, that's when we can really tap into this idea of finding who is there to collaborate. Because no amount of coaching, coercion, training, incentives has really changed an expert or a counselor into a collaborative coach. I really think we have our preferred way of working. And this isn't just about preferences or like, oh, this is how I like to do things. It's really connected, I think, to a deeper sense of how we contribute meaningfully as educators. And what's underneath it is this idea of, I'm in a school, the educators who care the most are in schools because we want to make a difference and contribute meaningfully. For the expert, contributing meaningfully means having autonomy to make those decisions. When they're doing that, that's when they feel they're doing their best work. And same for a coach. When they're working in collaboration and offering a unified, shared approach to teaching in collaboration with others, that's when they feel they're doing their best work. And same with the counselor. When they're negotiating with students and pursuing individual meaning, that's when they feel they're doing their best work. So in terms of how can we build strategies for more collaborative environments, to me, the first step is just simply knowing who's in the room and who you're asking to collaborate.
That's a wonderful metaphor, by the way.
Thank you.
So, do you have a story of a school that transitioned to be a more coach-oriented approach? What results did they see?
Yeah, so building off what I just said with the oak and the grapevine and all that stuff, I don't think you can change people quickly. However, I do think you can change schools and what I call their center of gravity more quickly. Because to me, every school has a center of gravity towards one of these three approaches. You'll find all three types of teachers in any school, but the overall, or kind of the average, the mean median mode of how things are done typically lean in one of these three directions. I was in a few schools that had been leaning more expert and wanted to move more into a coach approach. And in my book that's coming up, I talk about 4 pillars that you can build for each of the 3 types. And it's sort of like, if you get these things right, then everything else is kind of a decision downstream from those. So the coach pillars are data-driven decisions, differentiation, horizontal and vertical collaboration, and this idea of a whole school shared approach to teaching and learning, the things that we've touched on. So to move a school towards those pillars, and transparency should be included in there as well as one of the pillars. To move from that expert autonomy, there were like a few things where we wanted to bring more of that collaboration and more coherence between what was happening in the school. So in the German system, for example, for most classes, a student's final mark comes from 50% tests and 50% classwork. Now, 50% tests, that's pretty clear. And they had a specific number of tests you could have in a year. I think it was like between 4 to 6. But that classwork, everyone knew what that meant. But once you put all of those experts who've had their own autonomy around a table, it became apparent that no one was marking that 50% in the same way. And Riley, who's teaching grade 3, and Rob, who's teaching grade 3 next door, we were doing totally different things with that 50% classwork. Now, all of them were good, and you could have made a case for any of them, really, but there wasn't that horizontal and vertical coherence between the approaches. So the first step was just like, we need to agree that in all of our classrooms, we are assessing student work the same way. So that was one of the first steps, and that was huge. It's going to reduce those problems we have every now and then when a parent from one class sees the work of a child's from the other class, and then they start to ask questions, why don't these things align? Or why was it marked this way in one class and not in the other? And those sorts of things. We also made it just transparent about what these experts were teaching when. So each teacher, on one document, we shared one document across all staff. Literally, you can put 2 or 3 words per month, like, what topic are you covering which month? Just give us that broad of an overview. And just doing that opened up a lot of spontaneous and still autonomously led collaboration when all of a sudden teachers were going, oh, I didn't know that you even did that in this grade, because I'm doing a unit on X, Y, and Z. And there was just a spontaneous personal desire to collaborate between the teachers, because we're making it transparent. We're making it transparent how things are being marked. We're making it transparent what things are we covering at different times in classes. And it's each step you can build momentum towards one of those pillars. You're moving more and more direction into another type.
So when we're talking about the counselor model, this being the circle, flattened hierarchies, shared decision-making, really focusing on student meaning and self-direction, what are the benefits as well as potential pitfalls of this type of approach?
Yeah, and I think before I can get into the benefits and pitfalls, this one is the least common so far in our school system. But its ideas keep getting sprinkled in particular with the self-directed learning we'll get into in a moment. So I'm sure some people listening to this were like, hold on, the parents are involved in the decision-making? What does a flattened hierarchy mean in a school? I would say if you're in a conventional public system anywhere in the world, you've probably experienced either a coach or a counselor school or a school that's straddling between those first two we've talked about. This third one, the counselor, we've used this idea of a circle to represent its organization and its decision-making, but like a circle that's laying flat on the ground because there is no vertical hierarchy. We've seen those kind of pointy edges of the coach's star smooth out So there isn't concentrated decision-making power and rested flat into a circle. And you will still have roles. There might still be a head of school, but they are no longer the head of decision-making or the final voice on things. And in fact, they probably more have that role for reasons outside of the school. As the legal contact person for a school, I would highly recommend watching the School Circles documentary. I think it's from about 2018. It focuses on about 7 or 8 different schools that are counselor modeled schools in the Netherlands. There are schools like this when you start digging around in every country, but they are certainly the minority. It's a bit of a fringe niche thing. So these ideas are probably new to most people, but worth looking into because these are definitely ideas that keep trickling into the tug of war with these other two types. So very quickly, the pros here are that with a flattened hierarchy, each person who's involved, so staff, students, even parents, even possibly community members, has the power to influence school decisions and the environment that they are in. And this doesn't mean that anyone can just show up with an idea and we have to do it. There isn't just one circle, there are overlapping circles. So, of course, there will be certain circles that focus on certain areas. There might be a budget circle and a school grounds circle and a student fun field trip circle. And there will be different groups that will take on the responsibilities and decision-making for an area. And these circles overlap and communicate with each other, but there isn't one of them that has the final say, because when you do bring something forward and you're willing to do that work to bring forth the motion, you're also willing to work to find consensus and consent from the group for your approach. So you can bring something forward, but that doesn't mean that's happening. You then need those interpersonal skills of debating, perspective taking, and a willingness to find something that works for the whole group. And that is something that takes time. So the positive is anyone can bring forth something. So this means that good ideas are no longer just the responsibility of a head of school. They're no longer just the responsibility of staff. We're no longer doing even the democratic, more coach approach of, okay, we've got idea A or B. What are we voting for? 60% said A, 40% said B. We're going with A. And we'll make this 1 or 2 little concessions, but it's a 40% didn't agree to this. With the council approach, we're actually seeking consensus and consent, and we need to adapt our ideas to gain approval of the various circles. Now, that doesn't mean everyone's in love with the idea and thinks it's the best thing, but at least is willing to consent and say, there's no reason I actually have to say that this can't happen, essentially. So that is a huge positive. And when you dig into the healthy functioning versions of these schools, they're incredible places because the environment is being generated by the people involved. Now, what are some of the downsides? The first clear one to me is just the sheer amount of time, resource, discussion, and work that it takes to make a decision. And if we juxtapose that with the expert pyramid where we said, yeah, basically something you want to do in your class, if you're a teacher, that's up to you. Done. Here, those teaching and learning decisions, maybe I'll save the specifics of that in the negotiation for a moment, but at a school level, the decisions that the school is taking, because they need to involve everyone, require a series of very complex processes. And it's almost as though the downfall of this is it's like almost as though those processes are more important than results. And it's in order to maintain the integrity and the structure of this circle, here is how we make decisions, and we don't stray from that. And that in itself, although it's giving you total influence over your situation, is actually quite confining at the same time, as it requires a lot of work to make this happen.
For our listeners, I'm actually going to put that in the show notes. And so you'll be able to do that research and really dive into our counselor model even more.
Thank you for that. And there is another term for this that's out there, is to talk about sociocratic schools. So if sociocratic schools is a new term for people, highly recommend Google that. They go into the details of it in that School Circles documentary, but sociocratic is that organizing structure of the flattened circle.
Gotcha. How do schools, using the counselor model, ensure that learning remains meaningful and authentic for students, especially in this more self-directed setting?
Yeah, so I would say this is one of the gifts and one of the really special things that the counselor brings. I'd say it's the one, if done well, has the potential to be the most meaningful and the most intrinsically valuable to students. And the reason for that is because the action that's happening in the class, what's informing those teaching decisions, is negotiation. So we talked about autonomy with the expert, collaboration with the whole staff. So it's like staff as a whole are deciding what's happening in your classroom at the coach level. Now we're actually like kind of pushing the staff to the side. It's no longer about a teacher's autonomy or teachers collaborating. Now it's you as a counselor teacher and a student, and you are negotiating what their learning looks like. So you are negotiating what they're learning. So those first two, what you're learning was already a given. That's in the curriculum. Now, what it is you want to focus on is actually a negotiation between you and the teacher. And not only is what you're wanting to learn up for negotiation, how you are going to learn that is also up for negotiation. So every step of that learning process, you're consenting to. So you're actually actively working with the teacher who's serving as a counselor to throw out, like a counselor in real life, to throw out questions of things you're maybe not considering, blind spots that you have, other perspectives on this that you maybe haven't encountered or you're just not including yet. And together, it's this negotiation of what you want to learn. And it's a little bit unfair to say what they want to learn has 100% free reign, because what you will find in most counselor schools is perhaps a step away from a conventional curriculum as we've known them in a more expert or coach school, and towards usually two things that you'll find are the like themes and concepts. So quite often you'll see like transdisciplinary themes. So big ideas about like change or, just big concepts. And then it's the teacher's job to ensure that you're negotiating to focus into some of those big concepts and also the transdisciplinary skills. So to say there are skills like communication skills, self-management skills, the IB's PYP, transdisciplinary skills, maybe we can link to that as well after, gives a really good overview of what some of those transdisciplinary skills can look like. And that's what a counselor teacher needs to be negotiating with. It's no longer a set, solid curriculum, but rather general areas that we say over the course of a year, over the course of a student's career, these are the areas that they do need to touch in with. But the specific content and skills of exactly what those are, that's up to negotiation between the teacher and the student.
You've highlighted the role of consent and negotiation in the counselor model. How does this look like in practice, particularly with our younger learners?
Yeah, and what I would say before getting into the specifics of younger learners is that all three of these types have the potential to serve students well if they're done well. Usually at some point in the conversation, people ask me, okay, which one is best though? There's three. Clearly one of them is actually the best, right? And my answer to that is there isn't one that is objectively better than the others, but there is one that is best for your school's context. And there's one of these approaches that it will be more in alignment with your school's context based on the people who are there and the context of why those people are there. And again, in my book, I give, I think, 45 to 50 criteria you can consider and look at to really dive into what is your school's context and which of these three is the best fit. And one of those things can be the developmental stage of your students. And for some people, they might say, yeah, we're working with younger learners and we love the counselor approach, but that's actually not the best fit for our students. And there'll be others who will say, no, we've got younger students, and for our context as a school, the kinds of students who are with us, they are geared more towards self-directed. We'll go with that. I would say the principles don't change. Again, the School Circles documentary lays out a bit of how things are actively engaged with students of all ages, from young primary students up to high school. But I'd say just in general, regardless of age, but let's focus in on younger students, the first step is that tuning into interests and connections to their actual community around them, because what they're doing in the classroom or the circles they're participating in the school feed back as loops on each other. So if you've got a 6-year-old in your class who wants whatever it is, a new skateboard ramp or something like that out on the playground, that motion that they're bringing forward in those circles doesn't have to be in isolation. What they're actually doing in the school itself can translate back to the classroom. And that's where you could get into something like, you're probably going to want to make posters for your initiative. So let's talk about making an effective poster and some of the words you're going to need to learn how to spell and some of the patterns that we could fit in while doing that, and put that under our transdisciplinary skill of communication, under written and also verbal communication. How are you going to talk about this idea when you get to the circle? So actually practicing those skills in a real context, not in a separate teacher-led context. And then you'd also put that under some of those themes, and depending again on what the school's themes are, it could be something like health, a health-related theme. But I would say it starts with that interest, and there is a feedback loop between their actual participation in the processes of the school and what they're focused on when they're in that classroom.
So what skills and mindset shifts do teachers need to adopt when moving from more directive roles to more facilitative counselor-like roles?
Yeah, so it's difficult to go into the exact specifics, just because I think it differs a little bit person to person. But what I would say is each of these three types really, like, to me, they are just completely different job descriptions. So what makes someone a great expert teacher, that's not the same stuff that makes a great coach teacher. And just the same way, the skills that you need to be a great coach teacher do not make you a great counselor teacher. Sometimes I make a sports analogy that what helps you throw like a Hail Mary attempt in football doesn't translate to your golf swing and doesn't translate to like a tennis serve. So these are basically different job descriptions because they are three very different roles. Like they might as well be different careers. It might as well be like literally like coach, counselor, expert in a subject area. And I think that is where this is one of the strengths of this model of the three types, because it actually discerns that and really lays out that, oh, if you are taking on this role, there are certain skills and capacities you need to develop to do this role well. And one of the consequences of this is professional development isn't neutral. All of the professional development we can do is either more expert serving, coach serving, or counselor serving. And when we can start to see that and realize that PD isn't created equal, it's really professional development in one of these areas, then we can actually fine tune the kinds of things we're doing. Because honestly, if you look through like a catalog or website offerings, like everything sounds great. However, some of those, if I'm in a coach school, if I start learning about all this self-directed and sociocratic approaches, that's actually going to erode away at some of the strengths and gifts that my coach school is trying to offer. And it gets us back into that tug of war. So I think rather than trying to give you a list of what are the specifics, I would just say start to tune into a training that is being offered. Is it in service of the expert, coach, or counselor?
Wow.
I'm curious, what do you take from that?
When it comes to all three of the models, I see myself in the hierarchy, our pyramid, our expert. And so that's the way I actually view myself. But then what I want is to be this counselor, right? So it's definitely a dichotomy of who I am versus who I would want to be and the ideals that translate to the counselor model. And I really think that it's important how you differentiated our PD because, like you said, there's a tug of war. If I'm only focusing on how to be a better counselor, but even my school district has that more expert learning, how that could create issues in the classroom. And even in a coaching model, how that could disrupt our team environment with the vertical and horizontal responsibilities. That's very interesting.
Yeah, and just as you're seeing yourself more in alignment with some of these, maybe a little less with others, I also really believe that there's one type that each student resonates with most. I think students can gain benefit from any of the three types if that type is done well. But when you've seen students change from one of these types to another, and when you're looking at a school change or even a change from one teacher to another teacher, and you're looking at, was there a change in type here? To me, I've got several anecdotes I can give you of students who switched from a expert where things weren't working to a coach, and then it was working brilliantly. And then another student who was in the coach and that wasn't working for them, and they moved to counselor and that clicked, and that was where they thrived more. So just as like we do our work as one of these roles and get a sense of contributing meaningfully from that role, I think it's the same for students, that there's some of these that they will just click with more of the time than others as well.
I couldn't agree more. Specifically with our counselor model, how does this tap into students' passion and how do teachers navigate situations where students lose interest or direction?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important part because I think there's first this kind of illusion that you do the counselor and the kids are always invested because they've chosen and negotiated everything. The truth is, if you're a human, there are just certain things you do lose interest in. You know, even myself, like I've got a free afternoon and I've got one of my hobbies and it's, yeah, after an hour I realize actually I don't want to be doing this. I want to be doing something else with my time. You know, I guess there's two steps to that. The first one is this just something we can negotiate how you use your time? Is there something else we should use your time for now? Or if it really is time to step away from a project, or a student, when they get deeper into something, realize, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. And in fact, this has inspired actually something else I'm more interested in. Or maybe they don't have a new interest yet, but they just realize this isn't for them. Then you're just simply back to negotiating with the counselor teacher. And the counselor teacher can be asking those reflective questions of what was it you didn't enjoy? What did you think you were going to get from it? What else could we start to inquire into? What are 5 other things that were connected to what you learned from this that you might want to start to dig into and report back of which one of these might be actually better suited based on what you're interested in. So again, it's just that counselor approach of negotiation, helping students tune in and begin to negotiate. Okay, what is it you're wanting to do? How are we going to do that? When? With whom? All of those steps.
So can you share an example of a school where the counselor model has been implemented successfully, and what were the key factors that contributed to its success?
Yeah, and I think this is interesting because, of course, we want to use a word like success, but we start to realize that every word is loaded because when you start to look across the 3 types, each of the types can use the same term, but mean something quite different by it. So when we talk about success, we need to clarify. Are we talking about an expert's definition of success, a coach's definition of success, or a counselor's definition of success? And just as one really quick story, there was one staff meeting I had been a part of where a teacher had brought forth saying, hey, we'd like to do more self-directed learning. Who's interested in this? And there were about like 8 or 9 of us that got together at a follow-up meeting like a week or so later. And we sit down, we start talking, about 10 minutes in, there just wasn't harmony in the group. And 2/3 of the people were ready to leave. And it was like, hold on, I'm going to look at this through a types lens of maybe there's an expert perspective, coach perspective, and counselor perspective at clash here. And sure enough, there was, because those expert leaning people were saying, oh, when you said self-directed, I thought you meant like setting up students to be successful and fostering more independence. I give them what they need to do and they can direct themselves to do it. Whereas the more coach leaning people were like, oh, by self-directed, I thought we were talking about finding more choices for students in terms of the product and kind of the process, product, and content of their learning by giving students more choices, and they can choose from the matrix of choices and they direct themselves through those choices. And of course, those counselor leaning teachers are like, no, I just thought we were going to negotiate what are they going to learn? How are they going to learn it? When are they going to learn it, and with whom? I think it's really important to tune in that quite often with commonly used terms in conversation, each of these three types can at times have completely different and even contradictory definitions for what some of these words means. I know what we mean by success though. So what are the healthy versions of these types? We've spoken to some on our podcast. I think I'll mention again these school circles. I'm not like an affiliate advertiser or sponsor of them, just it's a fantastic documentary if this is a new concept. On our podcast, Reinventing Education, we have a conversation with the Agora schools in the Netherlands, which are an approach to schools done in a counselor approach. So you can hear about how they got started and some of their interesting navigation of school qualifications as part of a public school board, and how do you still meet the requirements of public schools and exams and university entrance and all these things, and have a completely self-directed approach. So that's really interesting. There was also the Romanian Alternative University, which was one of our earliest episodes on the podcast, where it was a completely self-directed university, which was quite fascinating. There are many, like I said, around the world. Just an Ontario example, there's actually one in Toronto, the Mary Ward Catholic Secondary School, which also exists within the public, or I guess Catholic system. And not only are they self-directed, but they have some of the highest scores on standardized tests for languages and things like that. Now, they openly admit, though, they say after a year or two, students realize for some of them that a self-directed approach is not for them, and that they do benefit better from a more expert or coach school. Now, of course, they don't have this language for it, but that's how I would interpret it. And the other one that kind of takes this to an extreme, which might not be an example of a school yet, but I think these ideas taken to their furthest conclusion, is a book from the 1970s by Ivan Illich called Deschooling Society, which actually talks about what are ways that we could have a post-school approach to education where learning resources were made available for people. And essentially, the book's proposing this idea of having counselor influences to still help students find learning communities, create their own learning paths, and all that stuff.
Looking back and scaling the lens back a little bit, can we compare these different types of models? How do the three models compare in their ability to foster student passion and intrinsic motivation? Are there contexts where one model might be more effective than the others?
Yeah, like I've said, I think any of these approaches can serve students if done well. And it's really just up to schools to be able to tune into which one of these three is best for their context. I think on the personal level, like all of us as teachers, I think the truth is, if you were to look at any given day or week or month or year of your teaching, you'll find moments where you are being more expert, more coach, or more counselor, regardless of what your center of gravity is. And I think that is just natural, because if you go back to the values, there are times we're either prioritizing that responsibility, achievement, or meaning. But there is one of these that serves as our home base or as our center of gravity, where we feel we're doing our best work from. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. And I think as long as you own which type you are and you're clear on that, and you know yourself in that way, of course you can like grab from the other two. But I think the important part is just not to the degree that it starts eroding the gifts and the positives of your type.
How would the demands on teachers differ across these three models? Are there specific burnout risks associated with each, and how can schools mitigate these?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because I think this idea of the three types gives us a really new perspective on burnout. I don't think this answers everything to do with burnout in schools, but I do think it helps provide some new insights on a few pieces of it. And in my book, I'm really talking about the idea that we want schools that do care and want to contribute meaningfully. But that doesn't mean the same thing for everyone. There's an expert way to contribute meaningfully, a coach way, and a counselor. And we've touched on this earlier, but when you're required to do the work of another type at the expense of the type that you are more in alignment with, that misalignment really creates a friction. And I think that friction over time is what wears people down, because you're still putting in the same amount of time, still putting in all the work into what you're doing. But all that time and energy and attention is to going to stuff that doesn't fully feel meaningful for you and is actually holding you back from contributing in the way that you want to. And it's certainly not the only cause of burnout, but I would say a misalignment between a teacher and the center of gravity of their school definitely creates the conditions for burnout, regardless of which type they are.
And from a leadership perspective, how can we support our teachers as leaders?
Yeah, so my first suggestion is just to be able to introduce this. And that either means by explicitly sharing it with staff or just acting like this is already true and having it inform your interactions with people and your communication. And to realize that a different type isn't wrong, it's just different. And I think it's easy when we know what our type wants and we hear ideas from another type that we're just like, how could you possibly think that's a good idea? Notice that they're not attempting to do our type poorly. They're attempting to do their type well. And I think when we begin to see that, that can help us get beyond the surface level of communication down to those values of responsibility, achievement, and meaning. And to really see that almost any conversation in a school, like if you turned off the volume, kept the people on the screen, and started giving subtitles, if you were to translate what they're saying, they're really just saying like responsibility, 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 no meaning, 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 no achievement, 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 underneath that layer of our words. And when you can start to engage with people that way, it's not a reductionary way of being like, oh, they're just about achievement or they're whatever, but it's actually an opening point for us to actually connect more deeply on the level of our values, and not a confusing level of values where, because of course all of us are going to say, we want to do what's best for students. We want to prepare them for the future. We want to build 21st century skills or whatever it is. But again, each of us means something very different by that according to our type. And as far as practical steps beyond the communication, practical steps for a leader, I say know your type and then be willing to set that aside for a moment to then ask, and which type is the best fit for my school's context? Because there's a chance that those two are not the same thing. And you as a leader are going to default to either building a pyramid, building a star, or building a circle every chance you get. And that may be a fit for your school's context, or it might not. And if it is a fit, great. You're in the best possible position to thrive and to contribute meaningfully. And if you're not, you need to be able to step back from your default mode and, to the degree that you can, serve as another type of leader because of the context. And I would put an asterisk on that. that's probably not sustainable long term. And use that knowledge to find a school and a context that you are a match for so that you can really flourish in all of your gifts. As a leader, know your type, know the type that is your school's context, and see if those are in alignment or not. And if they are, start building those pillars of the type. That's great. And if not, just realize that everything you're doing as a leader is being mediated through this misalignment of your type and the type that the school and its context will be best served by.
Rob, before we sign off, I'd like to ask if you could leave our listeners with one key insight from today's discussion, what would that be?
Yeah, it's just that invitation again to say, know your type and realize that these types are influencing everything in school, whether we acknowledge them or not. This is already influencing every conversation, every initiative, every decision that leaders, teachers, and parents and students, the reactions of students and alignment and all these things are already being influenced by this. This isn't something new you need to start doing. This isn't like 2025's hot new thing that all teachers have to add to their to-do lists or leaders try this new thing. This isn't new. This is just pointing out what's already there and begin to engage with it from this place and have it inform your communication and your conversations. Because whether you acknowledge it or not, you're still going to have to face the consequences of these three types. I think this just helps us dig into creating schools that people want to be in, because we're digging into this level of how are people feeling like they are contributing meaningfully through the work that they do in schools.
So before we wrap up, can you let our listeners know where they can find more about your work and then perhaps tune into the Reinventing Education podcast?
Yeah, so you can find us on all the podcast usual hangouts at Reinventing Education podcast with myself and Brendan O'Leary. If you're going to listen to just one episode, I recommend episode 124, which is called Start Here, which gives an overview of these three types of school, and we dig into it in detail. You can also find us. We have a YouTube channel, same name, Reinventing Education Podcast, and the same name on our Instagram page. And all of those can lead you towards our newsletter. And you can find us, we have a private Facebook group as well, where we post some of our work and media there.
Rob, I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed this conversation. It's been amazing. Thank you so much for being here today.
Riley, thank you for the opportunity and just thank you for your interest and support. I guess the one last thing I would say is I would love it if one day this idea of the three types was the first thing new teachers learned in Teachers College, because I think it just instantly sets us up for success. Once we know which type we are, it's like every decision comes after that to help reinforce it. So thank you so much for helping to engage with these ideas and get them out to your listeners.
I hope that too. So to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this episode of Innovating Education. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe, leave us a review, share it with your fellow educators and change makers in your network. Rob is also preparing to launch a Kickstarter for his upcoming book, which promises to dive deeper into these ideas. So stay tuned for more information on that project. Again, you can connect with Rob on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook at Reinventing Education Podcast for updates on the book and more insights into educational innovation. And of course, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to stay connected. Together, let's keep rethinking, reimagining, and reinventing education, one conversation at a time. Until next time, keep innovating.